So now everything that we have done in the past 2 weeks in GI physiology is getting us to this very point right now, today. We started with motility, swallowing, and we had to bring our food and our fuel inside our body. Now, our food and fuel, as it sits on our dinner plate, is absolutely useless to us. It smells good, cephalic phase, it stimulates all this activity. Get it into the body, you've got motility. Get it down further in the body, you've got mechanical and chemical digestion processes, and these are breaking down our components into their individual units for uptake in the body. So we talked about the carbs. This is our starch, our lactose, and our sucrose primarily. And we had to break those down into glucose, galactose, and fructose. We took those into the body. The other fuel source, food source we talked about was fats. Remember, the fats are in the form of triglycerides primarily, and we had to do the same principle with carbs. We had to digest those triglycerides down to its fatty acid units, then take them up into the body. The other dietary component are proteins. Again, proteins, we had to do the same principle. We had to use proteases from the pancreas, digest these down into amino acids. So these are our monosaccharides, these are our fatty acids, and these are the amino acids. Now, at this point, we talked about small bowel absorption, and that was the principles and the transporters to get these molecules inside and into the circulation. Now this turns out to be a very, very nice break between GI physiology and metabolism, because now we have officially entered the body. We've just gotten through doing all of our processing outside the body. We've got our nutrients absorbed inside the body. And now for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about how the body handles these different nutrients. So, how I'd like to structure this, which I found very useful in the past, is based on a positive versus negative energy balance. Now, this is how I want to start changing your thinking about biochemistry. Because as physicians, you're absolutely right. It's highly unlikely you're ever going to think about the Krebs cycle again. You're going to have to think about it before, March of next year, that big monster test. There'll be questions on there for the Krebs cycle, glycolysis, oxidative phosphorylation, urea cycle, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to take you through a lot of that. But as physicians, you're going to be thinking of positive versus negative energy balance, because this is where disease occurs. If you have an alteration in energy balance. So a positive energy balance typically means that we are in the fed state. So the fed state means that our bodies are an open system. So now remember chemistry, general chemistry principles. If you are an open system, that means outside elements can come in and influence the system itself. And that's what the fed system is. It's an open system because now we were taking food, energy molecules, and introducing it to our bodies, our system. When we're in a negative energy balance, this can be considered a closed system. Now, what I mean by closed system is that we are no longer taking in anything from the outside environment. Our bodies are now a closed chemical vessel. So that means we have to work with whatever we have available inside our body. So the easiest example of this looking at positive and negative energy balance. If somebody has increased positive and decreased negative, what would that indicate toward their weight? Gain. Yeah. This is weight gain. This is how we gain weight. Because the body, we're going to look at all of the different fuels and see that the body is absolutely 100% perfect, without fail and without exception, on calorie counting. So every calorie that is ingested is going to be accounted for either as storage or work. So if somebody has an increased positive energy balance, that means that they are taking in excessive calories than their body is using. Now, the opposite is true also. If you have a decreased positive energy, increased negative energy balance, this is going to be weight loss. Now let's zoom in a little bit on this positive and negative energy balance. So we've got our carbs, fats, proteins broken down into our monomeric units. We are now in our circulation. This is considered the fed state. So this is our open state. We are taking fuels in. This is also considered a positive energy balance. So if you were to look at the energy balance sheet of your body after you eat, you would be able to say, here's how much I'm taking in, here's how much I have available to me, and there's actually more what you're ingesting. So the first thing the body's going to do whenever you take in food is it's going to recognize that you've gone from a fasting state, which is the closed state, where the body is using what you have, and it's going to start saying, okay, the first thing I need to do is restore my energy level. And restoring energy level is the body's way of getting the ATP concentration up. So now we're oxidizing our fuels, we're generating ATP from this, but we only have a limited capacity of ATP possible in our body, in any of our tissues. So when ATP levels are maximum, we still have fuels coming in because we're still in a positive energy balance from the fed state. So the body is now designed to alter metabolism and shift metabolic direction. And what we're going to shift it into now is storage. Because again, the body accounts for every single calorie that you consume. And so what does storage look like? Well, we can take our glucose, which is our primary carbohydrate energy source, and we can store this as glycogen. Now, the two most prominent organs we're going to talk about for glycogen storage is skeletal muscle plus the liver. These two organs are going to be the main storage vessels for excess carbohydrates in the form of glucose. Now let's say we have fats. We have not oxidized all our fats, so we want to store them. And these fats will be stored as triglycerides. So we made triglycerides and the enterocytes put them into chylomicrons, and now the chylomicrons are going to be delivering these fats to all the tissues. The main one that it's going to store in is our favorite adipose tissue. So that's our primary storage vessel for fats. What about excess amino acids? Can we store amino acids? So the technical answer is yes, but the textbooks say no. Now the reason for that is because amino acids, we don't have a storage vessel. Can everybody read my writing? Okay.
Sorry.
If you can't read my scrawl, just let me know. So the amino acids, we don't have a storage capacity like we do for carbohydrates, glycogen, or fats and adipose tissue triglycerides. But what can we do with amino acids? We can make proteins out of them. So primarily what we're thinking about, and think about bodybuilders, what do? They shift their diets to increase amino acids to build up their muscles, build up the protein. Well, that actually turns out to be a reservoir of amino acids. So we can actually store these in the form of proteins. Now, something you're going to face on a daily basis as physicians is this arrow. Glucose making fats. Our glycogen stores in our body are limited. We only have so much skeletal muscle on us. We only have so much liver to store glycogen. So what happens if we've generated all of our ATP, we've generated all of our glycogen, we've filled up all these stores, but we still have glucose in our circulation? Do we pee it out? Oh no, the body conserves every calorie that you consume. So what we're going to do next is we're going to shift glucose and make fat and store the fat as triglycerides in adipose tissue. Now, from an energy storage standpoint, glycogen has a limited capacity in the body. What about adipose tissue? Is there a limitation on how much adipose the body can handle? And hence, as you've been hearing when people talk about fat causing Barrett's, fat causing fatty liver disease, this is going to be your number one problem as physicians, is dealing with this obesity problem. And that's because adipose tissue can just mount and mount and mount and mount and mount. We'll go into that in detail later. Okay, so now we've finished eating, and now we're going to move into the fasting state. So the fasting state is when the body now has to recognize that you do not have availability of any more fuel from the outside. That means we are a closed system. We have to live with what we have. Going from the fed to fasting state is an enormous metabolic shift. And it's all directed by hormones, insulin and glucagon. And we'll start talking about those later this morning. So when we're in a fasting state, that means you still need energy. So you're going to have to use the energy from the stores. So the first store is going to be glycogen. Now what you're simply going to do is you're going to recapture glucose from those glycogen stores. Now we have two glycogen stores. We have one in skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle simply is going to be using that released glucose from its own stores for energy. The liver fasting plasma glucose. So the liver is going to use its glycogen stores to maintain your plasma glucose levels. You'll hear me talk about skeletal muscle as being an incredibly selfish organ. It is very selfish. It grabs all the energy it possibly can, and it doesn't give up anything for nobody. Now, that may sound bad, But think about back in evolutionary times when you're doing your hunting, gathering, farming, whatever, and all of a sudden there's a mountain lion behind you that wants to eat you. Well, this is where the muscle has to be selfish. It has to maintain its own energy stores and reserves because it has to get you away from that hazard, that prey, predator. What about triglycerides? These are going to be released as fatty acids. And then tissues are going to take up the fatty acids and oxidize those to generate ATP. The shift from glycogen to fatty acid usage can be rather severe. And the reason for that is because glucose is our absolute #1 primary energy source. Fatty acids are secondary. We will use mostly glucose in our fasting state first, and then we will shift to fatty acids. So what consequence does this have to you as a physician? Well, you've got a patient that comes to you, person's 5'7", weighs 350 pounds, and says, I am really trying to lose weight. You ask, what are you doing? Well, I'm exercising more. How much are you exercising? Well, I'm walking 15 minutes every day. Okay, are they helping themselves? Not really, because that little bit of energy expenditure is going to be tapping into their glycogen glucose energy stores. They're not even getting near their fatty acid stores. Hence why you hear about sustained exercise. You know, when you're getting out there, 45 minutes, an hour worth. And that's because you have to go through some of your glucose before you can get to your fat stores. Okay? We'll go into these shifting mechanisms also. Now, what about proteins? Using these as amino acids. This is something we typically don't want to do because when you're breaking down proteins, you're breaking down muscle. They can be used for energy. So it's a horrible example to bring up, but think about the concentration camps back in the 1940s. The individuals in those concentration camps, what were they given to eat? Usually a small portion of bread, starch, a little bit of glucose, and water. The amount of food that they were given is not sufficient, and so they were in a constant negative energy balance, so they're losing more and more weight. What did they physically look like? Skeleton, right? They got down so you could barely see any muscle tissue, and it was mostly skin hanging on bones. So that tells you by that picture that we can actually capture these amino acids from proteins and use these for energy production. But it's a last-ditch effort. It's not what you want to do. And this gets into some serious diseases when we get into that kind of fasting pace. Now, is that bad? No, it isn't, because think about when we were evolving in times of fasting and times of drought and famine. We had to weather this for a long period of time. So our glucose stores might be gone, our fatty acid stores might be gone, and now we have to rely on our proteins and amino acids. So it tends to be quite an elaborate backup system for survival. Hopefully that you, the host, will start eating again and shift the metabolism around. Now, the loss of protein is indiscriminate in tissues. So you're going to lose protein from the biggest organs, the biggest organ being skeletal muscle. What about the pump? Is that made of protein? Yeah. So what happens if you start losing too much protein from the heart? It fails, eventually. And so that's where too much extraction of amino acids for energy becomes a problem, when you start compromising vital organs. Okay, we good with that orientation so far? Okay, so now what does this mean? Oh, I can do this right here. So now I want to zoom in a little bit more. And what we're going to look at now is something that we're going to refer to over and over again for the next 3 weeks. We're going to look at plasma glucose levels. And we're going to look at this because this is a beautiful monitor of our fed and fasting states. So under normal conditions, normal homeostatic conditions, we have a glucose level of approximately 90 milligrams per deciliter. That's the fasting glucose level. And of course that varies typically between 70 and 100 depending on the individual. Now when we eat, let's call this mealtime. And we're taking some carbohydrates into our diet. What's going to happen is our blood glucose level is going to go up because of all the processes that we saw in the last 2 weeks. Motility, digestion, absorption. Then what's going to happen, so this is absorption, to get this material into the body. Then over time, this is going to return to baseline. And this timing here occurs pretty much about 2 hours. So what's happening here? You're introducing glucose from your diet into the blood, and then the blood is responding by bringing the glucose down to normal levels, normal fasting levels. That means that we are taking in this glucose into cells. So this is cellular uptake. The primary organ that's involved in this is skeletal muscle. Secondary is liver. And that's mostly because of affinity, and we'll talk about that in organ size. Now, once we get here, this is considered the fasting state. So the fed state is defined when your glucose levels are significantly above normal fasting levels. When you get back down to homeostatic levels, this means now that you're in the fasting state. You're back into that closed system. So what does the body have to do? You now have to mobilize all of the energy that you have just taken up inside your cells. Now here's a big one we're going to talk about a lot, is that glucose is constantly being used, right? Because we have what's called a basal metabolic rate. That means all of our organs are constantly using glucose to generate energy. They're taking the glucose out of the plasma, out of the blood. So that means technically this could happen. We could extend this line down to 0 because tissues are taking glucose out. So what keeps this at normal fasting levels? This is the storage. So the liver is going to respond by putting glucose out to maintain that level. The liver is also going to perform synthesis. It's going to make glucose by gluconeogenesis. And the reason the liver does that is solely to maintain this basal, normal fasting glucose levels. If the liver didn't do that and your glucose levels begin to drop, what happens?
You get disoriented.
Become disoriented, you lose consciousness, you slip into a coma, and you die. We'll talk a lot about death in the next 3 weeks. And that's because your brain doesn't use fats for oxidation for energy. It uses primarily glucose. And so if your glucose levels go down sufficiently, the brain's activity starts to drop. So this is incredibly important, and we'll talk about that shift. Okay? Now, hopefully, what you're doing on this curve is going through a fasting state, and then Again, boom, it's lunchtime. And you eat again. You enter a fed state, bring in energy, store energy, go into the fasting state, release the energy. So this is the cyclical nature of our metabolic activity. Now, what happens hypothetically if you do this and you don't eat? And let's say you go out for a period here of 2 days. Do you have any glucose stores left? No, because we have a limited capacity in our muscles and our liver. The liver's still making glucose, but now at this point is when you are going to be relying on amino acids from your proteins and ketones from ketogenesis. So these principles here get out into long-term fasting starvation states. Now, ketones, ketone bodies, ketogenic acids, these are good. For you as practicing physicians, ketones generally will be bad. Because the problem is that when ketone synthesis gets deregulated, that can lead to a drop in pH in the blood, acidosis. And so that's where ketoacidosis comes from. And we'll talk about how metabolism is good to support ketones and what they're needed for, but then we'll talk about how metabolism gets hijacked, and so that ketones now become pathogenic. Okay? Again, the regulation points. Okay, so now let's zoom in a little bit more. And let's talk about ATP. Because our primary need that we have to generate is energy, and that's in the form of ATP. So our major molecule for ATP generation is glucose. Remember, we can use glucose. We can use glycolysis. We'll go over some regulatory features of this pathway. The end product of glycolysis is pyruvate. And then after pyruvate, there's one more step, and that's to form acetyl-CoA. The other molecule that we can oxidize are fatty acids. These fatty acids, when we do the beta oxidation, fatty acid oxidation, we can take these down to acetyl-CoA. Amino acids. The first step of amino acids is the nitrogen. The nitrogen is not very useful in our body. It's good for biosynthesis and for amino acids and nucleotides, but it's not very good for anything else. So we have to get rid of that. And how we're going to get rid of that is to form urea. And this is the source of urea for what bacteria? H. pylori. Yeah, urease activity. So once we get rid of that nitrogen, not all, but the majority of our amino acids we can take down to acetyl-CoA. Now along the way, we are generating NADH in glycolysis, NADH, FADH2 in fatty acid oxidation, and NADH and FADH2 in amino acid oxidation, the carbon backbone of amino acids. These are the currency that are going to generate our ATP. Now, I'm presenting this different, probably different than most of you have ever seen this, because most of you came through, you've got these individual pathways. You've got glycolysis, you've got fatty acid oxidation, you've got amino acid degradation, and you isolate these pathways. That's all going to change now. We're going to blend these pathways together and see how they interact. So, glucose down to acetyl-CoA, fatty acids, and amino acids. What's after acetyl-CoA?
Oxidase.
Yeah, the TCA cycle, tricarboxylic acid cycle. And that's because acetyl-CoA still has potential to be oxidized even further than these larger molecules. So what we're going to get out of the TCA cycle is NADH and FADH2. So all of these oxidative processes to make energy, to make ATP, are all going to come down to acetyl-CoA, and they're all primarily going to be generating NADH and FADH2. So this portion of all of metabolism is anaerobic. And it's anaerobic simply because oxygen is not required in any of these reactions. Now, the next step. This is the big one, and I heard somebody say this. Electron transport chain, also known as oxidative phosphorylation. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our NADHs, we're going to take our FADH2s, and we're going to funnel them all into the electron transport chain. So all metabolism is just simply a series of reductive and oxidative reactions. It's very simple. We're taking electrons from these large molecules, we're funneling the electrons to these carriers, NAD and FAD. They're going to hold those electrons, and then we're going to dump these electrons into the electron transport chain. And all while we're doing this, we're moving down an energy gradient. These electrons, when they move, they're going to generate energy. And so at this point down here is when we're making our ATP. But at the end of the electron transport chain, we have to have a place to dump the electrons. And where do we dump the electrons? Oxygen. So during this process here is where oxygen is required. And the product that we're going to generate is water. So this portion of energy generation is aerobic. Now, the other way to look at this, in a bigger scheme, is the first law of thermodynamics. Do you think the step one will ask you about thermodynamics? Nope. I've never seen anything in the NBA database that your final will come from. I'm going to have Michael Jordan help me with your final. So the reason I bring up the first law of thermodynamics, remember, this is where energy cannot be created and energy cannot be destroyed. And so this is the potential that we're looking at in energy generation. We have an enormous amount of energy stored in these molecules. We're going to release this energy. And as we release this energy, it has to be used somewhere else. And that's making ATP. So the energy is conserved. The first law of thermodynamics holds. We're just taking the energy here and transforming it into another energy carrier. Okay? This energy carrier happens to be very useful to us. Lots of ATPase activities, contraction, pumps, transporters, all of that stuff requires ATP. So all we're doing is we're taking this energy, transforming it into something that is useful energy. Okay? Now, what does this mean about our energy balance? Well, let's introduce this concept. Basal metabolic rate. So the basal metabolic rate is something that we all fight as we get older. The better name for this is called the resting energy expenditure. abbreviated REE. So what this is, and here's how it's measured. It's really kind of cool. You take somebody, you put them in this chamber. They have to be in a thermogenically neutral chamber. Simply means they have to be at a comfortable temperature. You don't want to elevate their temperature, you don't want to decrease their temperature. They sit there motionless for about 20 or 30 minutes. They can't move. And all they have to do is breathe. It's really kind of cool. And so what this is measuring is oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide exhalation, formation, how much carbon dioxide they're exhaling. And what you're measuring simply here is metabolism. Oxygen is going to be consumed by the electron transport chain. So the amount of oxygen used is a measure of your electron transport activity. The amount of carbon dioxide generated is going to be reflected by how much oxygen you're using and how much CO2 you're generating from these metabolic activities. So this is your basal metabolic rate. So what does that include when you're just sitting there kind of like a slug? Well, all of your organs. What's probably, well, there's two that are pretty close. What are the two most metabolically organs you got? Kidneys? I heard kidneys. And? Liver. You would think the brain. We have not evolved to that place. Well, let me say, starting at 8:15, your brains probably were using a lot more than your kidneys. You probably shut your organs completely down to get it all funneled into your head. So our organs are using an enormous amount. Kidney just uses a boatload of ATP because of all those transporter activities. Lots of ATPase transporters. So our organs are using this. What about this? Thermogenesis. We are warm-blooded. If we weren't warm-blooded and we didn't have thermogenesis, we would all not be sitting here right now. We'd be outside in the sun being a gecko, doing push-ups. They don't have internal control, so they have to do this to warm up in the sun. We have internal control. So this is going to take energy, thermogenesis, to keep our body core temperature up. There's also a little factor in there for a small amount of physical activity. You know, things like blinking, moving a little bit in this chamber. And so this is often accounted for in the basal metabolic rate, but it's a very small percentage. So now if we look at all of this, this is going to amount to approximately 80% of our daily energy use. 80%. Now, for those of you that might be more physically active, go out and do some hardcore exercise, sustain, sure, this percentage of your daily use is going to go down because your physical activity is offsetting that. So why is this so important? Well, to a physician, you need to counsel your patients as they want to lose weight. I gave you this chart. This is the amount. The calculation is kilocalories per day, and this is what's estimated by the National Research Council in order to have the amount of calories you need to maintain an equal energy balance sheet for your resting energy expenditure per day. I calculated mine in here. I think it was about 1,600 calories. Do you know the difference between calories and kilocalories? Capital calories? Not small calories, small caps, but big caps. One big cap calorie? I sound like a McDonald's commercial. Big cap calorie. equals 1 kilocalorie. So a calorie written in large numbers is actually a misnomer by the marketing companies, but 1 large calorie here equals 1 kilocalorie, which is 1,000 calories. So this is a measure of energy in physics and chemistry. This is something, so if you actually eat 1,600 calories, you're actually eating 1,600 times 1,000 calories. That's even scarier, but so nobody would ever buy your product if you told them they had that many calories. So why is this important to you as a physician? Well, look at these multiplication factors here. Not to pick out women as an example, but this turns out to be a very significant drop right here. Going from 18 to 30 to 30 to 60. So those of you that are over 30 in here, I apologize. But you're going to have women coming to you, and they're going to be about 50, 55 years old. And they're going to tell you, you know, damn it, I walk an hour a day. I've cut down on my eating, and I can't lose a pound. Well, why is that? Look at this basal metabolic rate. That factor dropped. So the basal metabolic rate, resting energy expenditure, drops with aging. And so that means, in order to burn the fat calories, the calories in 1 inch here for a 60-year-old is the same as it is for a 20-year-old. But with a lower basal metabolic rate, you have to do that much more physical exercise to offset that to get into a negative energy balance to lose weight. See why it's hard to lose weight? Now this factor here I go again, picking on the ladies. Postmenopausal. That has another factor because without that coursing fluid of estrogen, estrogen is a beautiful, beautiful hormone. You're going to learn about this later on in this block and then in repro block. Estrogen, ladies, is what protects you from so many diseases that us guys suffer from. It's protective, it's a vasoprotection against blood pressure, heart disease. It's also for Alzheimer's disease. There's evidence that estrogen is wonderful. It also helps maintain your basal metabolic rates. So postmenopausal women, their basal metabolic rates tend to be even lower. So get somebody into their 65 and 70 and now they're really having trouble losing weight. Yes?
Why do you get a decrease from 10 to 18 and then an increase again?
That's a good question. I don't know. That was never explained in any of the literature I could find. But O to be 0 to 3 again, huh? Just for like a couple of weeks. Just to get that extra off. Okay.
Is that graph in calories or kilocalories?
That is in kilocalories per day. That number what you calculate, right? This number here. So this calculation that you would do here, formulate, will give you kilocalories per day.
So mine comes out to 2,000 kilocalories a day?
To maintain your basal metabolic rate. So what does that mean, 2,000? Yeah, so 2,000 calories means that if you just do, light exercise, move around, get up in the morning, come here, take exams, no, that's stress, that's even more. But just normal basal metabolic rate, 2,000 calories will keep you at an even balance sheet. 2,000 kilocalories, right. It sounds like a lot, but that's equivalent to 2,000 calories in capital letters. It does sound like a lot.
That's what all the labels are, I think.
Yeah.
Just 2,000 calories, like what it says on the package.
Yeah, so
everything's already measured in kilocalories.
Yeah.
2,000 calories is normal. Like, it's what we want you to eat, but people eat like 5,000 calories a day.
So whopper.
Yeah.
it's going to tell you how many calories. So when I say that blizzard is 1,000 calories, it's 1,000 of these capital calories, but it's also 1,000 kilocalories in that amount of food. So that sounds like a lot. Mine is 1,600. So this is a good example. If you and I wanted to lose 10 pounds, we had a race to lose 10 pounds, who's going to do it easier? Right, exactly. I'm jealous. So Michael Phelps eats, what, 10,000 calories a day? 10,000 kilocalories a
His
day.
energy expenditure is like, I don't know, 9,000 calories.
His energy expenditure is through the roof. And so it's not a problem. So that's where the body counts everything. Okay, so now, how do we regulate metabolism? So what we're going to primarily talk about is not all the gory details about all these little individual pathways and the chemistry that goes behind them. We're going to talk a lot about the regulation points. So I'm going to borrow a picture from Mark's Medical Biochemistry. I just love this picture. It's very descriptive. So if you've got a freeway, with one exit, and you've got cars going down this freeway, this is the equivalent of a metabolic pathway. Because what you have are cars moving in between these points. So let's say this is point A, this is point B, point C, point D, point E. So these are substrates converting to products, typical biochemical reaction, but they're moving from one place to another. If you have no regulation on a biochemical pathway, the amount of substrate, which in this example are the number of cars, will control the flux going through this pathway. So that means if you have a lot of cars starting out here, you can get a lot of cars moving through. Same thing with a pathway. Now what happens if you increase the amount of substrate? More cars going onto this freeway. Traffic, yes. Horrible traffic. That means that you are now saturating a pathway. So too much substrate equals saturate. Biochemical pathway is the same as traffic. If you increase the amount of A to make B to make C, D, and E, you're going to slow this reaction down because you've maximized it, and this becomes what is called your rate limiting step. And it's your rate limiting step because all of these are working as fast as they can. This is working as fast as it can, but you have an excess of substrate. So excess of cars, the limitation of these cars moving is the width of that road. Now, here's where biochemistry gets interesting and fun, and this is where medicine comes in. What happens if you need to take a detour? Let's say you were going to C prime. Let's say that this direction is the preferential way. How would you take a detour to go to C prime? If most of your substrate and products are just flowing right here, the car's moving along. You block something, right? You'd inhibit something. So if you inhibited this place right here, inhibit this enzyme, that is going to prevent the conversion of B to C. The concentration of B begins to increase. There's only two directions that B can go. It can either go backwards or it can go down C prime. What if we put a block on A to B? If we put a block on A to B, so this is not reversible, the concentration of B starts to increase. The only place it can go is down to C prime. How does that work with our cars? Now the example, I love to beat up on Caltrans. I grew up in Southern California, and Caltrans is like, they're supposed to help us with the roads, but they always like to put up barriers so they can do their work at 7 a.m., like rush hour. So if we put a barrier here, let's put a barrier right there. This is Caltrans.
Sleep.
Use it, yeah, and use it means what are we generating? ATP. So let's call E ATP. What if our ATP levels are maximized? We can't make any more. We want to store it. So, but this pathway here going A to E with glucose to make ATP, that is the prime pathway. So how can we alter this pathway to create a storage pathway?
Block it.
Block it. So let's block it here. And what are we going to block this with? Don't say drug. We'll get there. What's a natural compound that you can slow the progression down this and shift it to here, which would be glycogen?
Insulin.
Insulin? Yeah, you're getting ahead of me.
Hormones.
We'll get there at the end of the week.
ATP.
ATP. Feedback. Yeah, this is a negative feedback. So if you have ATP inhibiting this enzyme from the step of B to C, B is going to build up, and now you can shut this into glycogen storage. So by monitoring what's going on at the end of the pathway, we can feedback on this and we can alter the pathway. Now, this here, to show you there's actual physical relevance to this, medical relevance, is that we have diseases. Glycogen storage diseases. What these diseases are is this pathway is perfectly intact. You can make glycogen all you want, it's really, everybody's happy. But this release of glycogen to make glucose is inhibited because the enzyme is mutated. And that is a glycogen storage disease, and we'll go over quite a few of those. Those are called inborn errors of metabolism. Okay? The reason I point this out is because I took it out of the curriculum largely last year, and in a class of 2019, they slapped me around on the post-step 1 review. Oh my God, it was just embarrassing. In fact, it was so bad, I think Dr. McGuire even made fun of me. It's like, wow, look at this review about Orlando, because it was like Orlando, Orlando, Orlando. Nobody else, everybody else was fine, right? And it was primarily because I kind of left this out. So this class is going to get hammered with this. Why are you going to get hammered? Because this on the step 1 is huge, and on our MBME final, turns out there's a lot of questions on this. So pay very close attention to this.